Why do you still do it? Why are you still out here?
Well, it goes back to the destiny thing. I mean, I made a bargain with it, you know, a long time ago, and I'm holding up my end.
What was your bargain?
In 1979, the world's most famous Jewish songwriter shocked everyone by becoming a Christian. His fans were outraged. Critics called him crazy. For years, nobody knew why Bob Dylan really turned his back on his roots. Now, at last, the shocking truth comes out. It wasn't a spiritual awakening that made him switch religions. It was a hotel room encounter so powerful, it knocked him down. What really happened that night in Arizona? And why did he suddenly go back to Judaism after writing 3 Jesus-loving albums? The answer will leave you speechless. Bob Dylan was born Robert Allen Zimmerman on May 24, 1941, in Duluth, Minnesota. His father, Abram Zimmerman, worked for the Standard Oil Company until polio left him unable to continue. After that, the family moved to Hibbing, a small iron mining town in northern Minnesota. It was a quiet place with fewer than 20,000 people, but for Dylan, it was where his love for music began. He spent hours listening to the radio, drawn to the sounds of country, blues, and early rock and roll. Elvis Presley, Chuck Berry, and Little Richard fascinated him. Little Richard's wild energy and stage presence made a lasting impression. Dylan admired him so much that in his high school yearbook, he wrote that he wanted to join his band. By his teenage years, he was teaching himself guitar and piano. He started forming bands, playing anywhere he could. One of his first groups, the Golden Chords, performed rock and roll covers at school dances. For a brief time, he even went by the name Elston Gunn while playing in another band. He loved the excitement of performing, but as time went on, he felt that rock and roll lacked depth. He wanted something more. After graduating from high school in 1959, he briefly considered using the stage name Robert Allen before settling on Bob Dylan. Around this time, his interest in music began to shift. Rock and roll was exciting, but the lyrics didn't say much. Years later, in an interview, he explained why he moved away from it, saying, "The thing about rock and roll is that for me, anyway, it wasn't enough. The songs weren't serious or didn't reflect life in a realistic way." That realization led him to folk music. Later that year, he enrolled at the University of Minnesota. He didn't stay long, but it was an important time for him. At local coffee houses, he discovered folk music and the power of storytelling through song. Woody Guthrie and Ramblin' Jack Elliott became his biggest influences. Guthrie's songs were about real people, real struggles, and real life. Dylan connected with that in a way he never had with rock and roll. After just 1 year, he left college to focus entirely on music. In January 1961, he arrived in New York City with a clear purpose. He wanted to meet Woody Guthrie. At the time, Guthrie was in Greystone Park Psychiatric Hospital in New Jersey, suffering from Huntington's disease. Dylan visited him and played songs at his bedside. That meeting confirmed what he already felt. Music could be about something bigger than entertainment. He later called himself Guthrie's greatest disciple. He saw Guthrie as the true voice of America, an artist who told the truth no matter how hard it was. Dylan even wrote a song in his honor, Song to Woody, which was included on his debut album in 1962. The lyrics paid tribute to Guthrie, while also announcing Dylan's arrival as a songwriter in his own right. Bob Dylan arrived in New York City in January 1961 with a guitar, a restless spirit, and a dream of meeting Woody Guthrie. He was just 20 years old. Guthrie had shaped the way Dylan saw music, turning folk songs into powerful stories about real people and real struggles. But Guthrie was in the hospital, battling Huntington's disease. That didn't stop Dylan. He visited him, played songs for him, and soaked in every word. Through Guthrie, Dylan met Ramblin' Jack Elliott, another folk singer who had learned directly from the legend. Elliott helped Dylan find his way into the heart of Greenwich Village, a place that would shape his future. In the early 1960s, Greenwich Village was alive with music, poetry, and ideas. It was the center of the folk revival, a movement that brought old songs back to life and used them to speak about the world. Coffee houses and clubs like Gerda's Folk City gave young artists a place to perform. Dylan played wherever he could, standing out with his raw voice and poetic lyrics. He didn't sound like anyone else. On September 29, 1961, the New York Times took took notice. A review called him one of the most distinctive stylists in the city's folk scene. Dylan wasn't just performing, he was absorbing everything. He borrowed from traditional folk songs, but his lyrics were different. He sang about civil rights, war, loneliness, and change. His music spoke to the moment. People listened. By the end of 1961, he was no longer just another singer in Greenwich Village. He was becoming something more. Then came the break that changed everything. In September 1961, Dylan played harmonica on folk singer Carolyn Hester's third album. John Hammond, the producer behind the session, was impressed. He saw something in Dylan that others missed. 1 month later, in October 1961, Hammond signed him to Columbia Records. Dylan had a record deal, but success wouldn't come easily. His debut album, Bob Dylan, was released on March 19, 1962. It featured mostly traditional folk songs with just 2 originals, Song to Woody and Talkin' New York. The recordings were simple, just Dylan's voice, guitar, and harmonica. The album barely sold, reaching only about 5,000 copies. Some at Columbia thought signing him had been a mistake. There were talks of dropping him from the label, but Hammond believed in him and fought to keep him on. Dylan wasn't discouraged. He kept writing. 1 year later, on May 27, 1963, Dylan released the freewheelin' Bob Dylan. This time, everything changed. Unlike his first album, which was filled with old folk songs, Freewheelin' featured mostly original compositions. Songs like Blowin' in the Wind and A Hard Rain's A Gonna Fall turned Dylan into the voice of a movement. Blowin' in the Wind was inspired by the Negro spiritual No More Auction Block. It asked simple but powerful questions about freedom and justice. The song became an anthem when Peter, Paul, and Mary recorded it. Their version sold over 1 million copies and reached number 2 on the Billboard charts. A Hard Rain's A Gonna Fall captured the fears of the time with vivid, almost surreal imagery. The song reflected the anxiety surrounding nuclear war, painting a picture of a world on the edge. Dylan's lyrics were unlike anything in folk music. He wasn't just singing about old stories. He was writing about the world as it was happening. Critics called Freewheelin' a masterpiece. The album reached number 22 in the US and later hit number 1 in the UK. Dylan was now a rising star. Some labeled him the spokesman of a generation, though he rejected the title. He didn't want to be anyone's leader, he just wanted to write songs. But whether he liked it or not, his music was becoming the soundtrack of the 1960s. In just 2 years, Dylan had gone from an unknown singer in Greenwich Village to one of the most important songwriters in America. And this was only the beginning. Bob Dylan's shift from acoustic folk to electric rock in 1965 was one of the most shocking moments in music history. His album, Bringing It All Back Home, released on March 22nd, marked the beginning of this transformation. It mixed electric instruments with his signature poetic lyrics, creating a sound that left folk purists stunned. They had seen Dylan as the voice of their movement, a songwriter who spoke for social justice, with nothing but a guitar and a harmonica. Now, he was plugged in and heading in a new direction. The opening track, Subterranean Homesick Blues, moved fast. The lyrics rushed out in a stream of sharp social commentary, setting the tone for what was to come. The line, "You don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows," was a clear message. Dylan was tired of being labeled as a leader of the counterculture. He was pushing forward whether people liked it or not. Maggie's Farm was even bolder. It was a loud and rebellious break from the expectations placed on him. Dylan wasn't just experimenting with a new sound, he was making it clear that he would not be controlled by the music industry or the fans who wanted him to stay the same. Even outlaw blues challenged social norms. It addressed interracial relationships at a time when the topic was still controversial in mainstream music. Some called Dylan a sellout. Others saw him as a visionary. But no matter how people felt, the album was a success. It reached number 6 on the Billboard charts and proved that Dylan's new sound had an audience. He was no longer just a folk artist. He was shaping the future of rock music. Then came the moment that changed everything. On July 25, 1965, Dylan stepped onto the stage at the Newport Folk Festival. This was a sacred place for folk music. music, a gathering of purists who believed in acoustic instruments and raw storytelling. Dylan had performed there before, but this time was different. He was holding a Fender Stratocaster. Behind him were members of the Paul Butterfield Blues Band. With no warning, he launched into Maggie's Farm. The response was immediate. Some cheered, others booed. The second song, Like a Rolling Stone, only added to the chaos. People in the audience shouted in protest. Some say Pete Seeger, a folk legend, was so upset that he wanted to cut the power cables. Others claim the real issue was poor sound quality. Either way, the night became known as the moment Dylan went electric. It didn't end there. At later concerts, fans heckled him. At a show in Manchester, England, in May 1966, one person yelled, "Judas!" But Dylan never backed down. He turned to his band and told them to play it loud, and they did. Less than a month after Newport, Dylan released Highway 61 Revisited on August 30th, 1965. If Bringing It All Back Home had introduced his new sound, this album fully embraced it. The title referred to the highway that ran from his Minnesota hometown down through the heart of blues country. The album was a collision of rock, blues, and surreal storytelling. The opening track, Like a Rolling Stone, was unlike anything else on the radio. It was over 6 minutes long, breaking the typical limit for hit songs. The lyrics were raw, painting a picture of someone who had fallen from grace. It became one of the most influential songs in rock history. Other tracks, like Ballad of a Thin Man and Desolation Row, showed Dylan at his sharpest. He was telling stories, but now they were filled with strange characters and eerie imagery. The album peaked at number 3 on the Billboard charts and became a defining moment in his career. Dylan wasn't finished. In May 1966, he released Blonde on Blonde, the first double album in rock history. It pushed boundaries even further. Songs like Rainy Day Women, number 12 and 35, had a loose, chaotic feel, while Visions of Johanna was haunting and poetic. Critics praised the album, calling it a masterpiece. It reached number 9 on the charts and set the stage for the era of albums as full artistic statements rather than just collections of songs. Dylan was at the peak of his career. Then, everything came to a sudden stop. On July 29, 1966, he crashed his motorcycle near Woodstock, New York. The details of the accident remain unclear. Official reports say he fractured vertebrae in his neck, but there were no ambulance records or hospital reports. Some believe the accident gave Dylan a way to escape the pressure of fame. He had been moving at full speed, recording, touring, and constantly being pulled in different directions. Now, he had a reason to step away. Dylan spent the next few years in Woodstock, writing and recording. In the basement of a house called Big Pink, Dylan and the band started recording. These sessions became known as the basement tapes. They weren't meant for an album, just a way to make music in a relaxed setting. The sound was raw and stripped down, pulling from folk, blues, and country. Dylan wasn't chasing radio hits or trying to top the charts. He was reconnecting with traditional American music, writing songs that felt timeless. Over the course of 1967, they recorded more than 100 tracks. Some were originals, like Tears of Rage and Clothesline Saga. Others were covers of old folk and blues songs. The lyrics were different from his earlier work. Blonde on Blonde had been full of wild, surreal storytelling, but these songs were simpler. They had humor, sadness, and a deep sense of history. It was a completely new direction for Dylan, but it wouldn't be fully recognized until years later. At first, the recordings weren't officially released. Instead, they spread through bootlegs, including the famous Great White Wonder in 1969. When the basement tapes finally came out in 1975, they reshaped rock music. The rough, rootsy style influenced bands like The Byrds, Creedence Clearwater Revival, and even the Beatles during their Get Back sessions. Dylan himself later described the experience as peaceful and unpressured, just a group of musicians playing for the love of it. Not long after, Dylan took another unexpected turn. He went to Nashville and recorded John Wesley Harding. Released on December 27, 1967, the album was quiet and stripped down, with only bass, drums, and guitar. It was a sharp contrast to the electric chaos of Highway 61 Revisited just 2 years earlier. This time, Dylan's lyrics were filled with biblical imagery and moral questions. All Along the Watchtower was the standout track. It became even more famous when Jimi Hendrix turned it into a searing rock anthem. Dylan wasn't done with Nashville. In 1969, he released Nashville Skyline, a full country album that caught everyone off guard. His voice had changed. It was softer, smoother, completely different from the raspy tone fans were used to. He recorded Girl from the North Country as a duet with Johnny Cash, who had been one of his biggest supporters. Cash even wrote the album's liner notes and won a Grammy for them. The recording sessions were laid back and fun. Musicians like Charlie Daniels and steel guitarist Pete Drake joined in, giving the songs a polished but easygoing feel. Lay Lady Lay became one of Dylan's biggest hits, showing that country music wasn't just for traditional country fans. He was breaking down barriers between genres, blending folk, rock, and country in a way that made sense to a wide audience. At the time, country music wasn't taken seriously by the rock world, but Dylan's involvement helped change that. Just when it seemed like he might settle into this sound, he made another unexpected move. In 1973, he took a role in the Western film Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, directed by Sam Peckinpah. Dylan played a quiet drifter named Alias, a small role, but a memorable one. He also wrote the film's soundtrack, including Knockin' on Heaven's Door. The song was written for a dramatic death scene, but soon became one of Dylan's most famous compositions. Over the years, it was covered by artists like Eric Clapton and Guns N' Roses, turning it into a rock classic. The filming process was chaotic. Peckinpah was unpredictable, and there were tensions on set. Despite this, Dylan's presence added something special. His name was a major selling point, and in some international markets, promotional posters listed him as the film's main star, even though his role was minor. Bob Dylan's personal life was as unpredictable as his music. He moved through relationships with the same restlessness that defined his career. Some of these love stories inspired his greatest songs, while others ended in heartbreak. Through it all, Dylan stayed an enigma, revealing little about his personal struggles, but leaving clues in his lyrics. In the early 1960s, Dylan and Joan Baez became the golden couple of folk music. Baez was already a star when she met Dylan in 1963. She had a devoted following and used her platform to support political causes. Dylan was still an up-and-coming songwriter, but Baez believed in him. She invited him to perform at her concerts and introduced him to her audience. In those years, they seemed inseparable. They sang together, traveled together, and for a while, they shared the same vision. But cracks in their relationship started to show. Baez was passionate about activism, but Dylan didn't want to be the voice of a movement. His focus was on songwriting, and as his fame grew, he began pulling away. Everything came to a head in 1965. Dylan invited Baez to join him on his UK tour, but when she arrived, he refused to let her perform on stage. She was left watching from the sidelines, feeling humiliated and hurt. By mid-1965, their relationship was over. The breakup was painful enough, but what made it worse was Dylan's sudden marriage to another woman. Less than 6 months after leaving Baez, he married Sarah Lowndes. The betrayal cut deep. Years later, Baez turned her heartbreak into music. Songs like Diamonds and Rust and Winds of the Old Days carried echoes of her time with Dylan. He rarely spoke about their split, but in later interviews, he admitted that the madness of his career played a role. Their romance had lasted only a few years, but its impact never faded. On November 22nd, 1965, Dylan married Sarah Lowndes in a private ceremony that even his parents didn't attend. At the time, Sarah was pregnant with their first child, Jesse, who was born on January 6, 1966. Over the years, they had 4 more children together: Anna, Samuel, and Jacob. Dylan also adopted Maria, Sarah's daughter, from her previous marriage. They built a quiet life in Woodstock, New York, where Dylan wrote some of his most personal songs. Sad-Eyed Lady of the Lowlands and Sarah were both inspired by his wife, filled with admiration and longing. For a while, it seemed like he had finally found stability. But by the 1970s, their marriage was falling apart. Rumors of Dylan's infidelity began to spread, and the pressures of fame only made things worse. They separated several times before finally divorcing in 1977. Even after the divorce, Sarah remained a major figure in his life. She was the mother of his children, his muse, and a reminder of a life he once had. Their love story was even woven into Ronaldo and Clara, a 1978 film that blurred the lines between reality and fiction. Then came a secret that Dylan kept hidden for years. In 1986, he married Carolyn Dennis, one of his backup singers. Few people knew about their relationship, and even fewer knew they had a daughter together. Desiree Gabrielle Dennis Dylan was born that same year. Dylan and Carolyn went to great lengths to keep their family out of the public eye. They even used California laws to seal their marriage records. It wasn't until 2001 that the truth came out in Howard Sounds' biography, Down the Highway: The Life of Bob Bob Dylan. By then, Dylan and Carolyn had already divorced. Their marriage ended in 1992, but they remained on good terms for the sake of their daughter. Carolyn later described Dylan as a wonderful father who had always been present in Desiree's life. Beyond his relationships, Dylan also battled personal struggles. In a rare 1966 interview, he admitted to having a heroin addiction while living in New York. He said he had a $25 a day habit, but claimed he overcame it without professional help. The revelation was shocking, especially since Dylan had always downplayed his drug use. The 1960s were a chaotic time, and many artists turned to drugs to keep up with the demands of touring and performing. Dylan was no exception. Reports suggest he used amphetamines during his 1965-66 electric tour, pushing himself through grueling performances. Some say his addiction was more serious than he let on, while others believe he exaggerated the story. Bob Dylan's spiritual journey is one of the most dramatic transformations in music history. In 1979, he shocked the world by embracing Christianity. This wasn't just a quiet shift in belief. It changed his music, his performances, and the way people saw him. It started in late 1978 during a concert when an audience member threw a small silver cross onto the stage. Dylan picked it up and held onto it. Later, in a hotel room in Tucson, Arizona, he experienced something he could never forget. He said he felt the overwhelming presence of Jesus Christ. It wasn't just an idea or a vision. Dylan described it as a physical moment that knocked him down and lifted him up at the same time. Jesus put his hand on me. It was a physical thing. I felt it all over me. That experience led to Slow Train Coming, recorded between April and May 1979. The album was unlike anything he had done before. The lyrics were deeply Christian, with no room for interpretation. Gotta serve somebody made it clear. You either served God or the devil. There was no in-between. The song won a Grammy and proved Dylan was serious about this new chapter. He also joined the Vineyard Christian Fellowship Church in Los Angeles, where he spent hours studying the Bible. He became especially drawn to end-time prophecies from the Book of Revelation. Not everyone was ready for this version of Dylan. Fans had known him as the voice of rebellion. They connected with his protests and poetic lyrics. Now he was quoting scripture at his concerts. He warned about the apocalypse and refused to play his old hits. Many walked out of his shows. Some stopped buying his albums. Critics had mixed reactions. Some praised him for his boldness. Others dismissed this phase as Dylan's god-awful gospel. But Dylan didn't back down. In 1980, he released Save, another album filled with religious themes. A year later, he followed up with Shot of Love. The music was powerful, but for many longtime fans, the message was too direct. By the mid-1980s, something changed again. Dylan never publicly renounced Christianity, but his music slowly moved away from religious themes. Then, in 1986, he surprised everyone by reconnecting with Judaism. He had been born Robert Zimmerman into a Jewish family in Minnesota, but religion had never played a major role in his early career. Now he was seen attending events connected to Chabad Lubavitch, an ultra-Orthodox Jewish movement. Between 1986 and 1991, Dylan appeared on Chabad's annual To Life Telethon, a fundraiser broadcast from Los Angeles. He also took part in Jewish rituals privately. As always, he didn't explain his choices. He never announced a break from Christianity, but it was clear he was exploring something different. His music reflected this shift too. In 1983, he released Infidels, an album that included Neighborhood Bully. Many saw the song as a strong defense of Israel. Lines like, "His enemies say he's on their land, they got him outnumbered 1,000,000 to 1," were interpreted as a statement on Israel's struggle. Bob Dylan has never been one to follow the rules. He has spent his career pushing boundaries, sometimes in ways that shocked even his most devoted fans. One of the earliest and most controversial moments came on December 13, 1963. Just 3 weeks after President John F. Kennedy's assassination, Dylan stood in front of a packed room at the Emergency Civil Liberties Committee's annual dinner to accept the Tom Paine Award. The award recognized his contributions to civil rights, but instead of a safe and expected speech, Dylan delivered a statement that outraged nearly everyone in the room. Visibly intoxicated, he said something no one could believe. "I've got to admit that the man who shot President Kennedy, Lee Oswald, I saw some of myself in him." The audience erupted. People hissed and booed. It was a moment of pure shock. How could the rising voice of social justice say something like this? Dylan tried to explain himself. He said he wasn't defending Oswald, but rather acknowledging that violence doesn't happen in isolation. He believed that people like Oswald didn't appear out of nowhere. They were shaped by the world around them, just like everyone else. But his explanation didn't help. The timing was too raw. Kennedy's assassination had devastated the country, and sympathy for his killer, no matter how philosophical, was unacceptable. The backlash was immediate. Newspapers condemned him. Fans were furious. The controversy spread far beyond that room in New York. Realizing the damage, Dylan later issued a statement. He refused to apologize, but tried to clarify his words. "If there's violence in the times, then there must be violence in me," he wrote. He wasn't saying Oswald was right. He was saying that a violent society produces violent people. Still, the damage had been done. It was one of the first times Dylan found himself at the center of a storm, but it wouldn't be the last. Just months earlier, in May 1963, he had walked away from one of the biggest television opportunities of his career. He was set to perform on The Ed Sullivan Show, a program watched by millions. It was a huge chance for exposure, but it ended before it even began. During rehearsal, CBS executives listened to the song he planned to perform, Talkin' John Birch Paranoid Blues, a satire mocking extreme anti-communist paranoia. The song mentioned the John Birch Society and even referenced George Lincoln Rockwell, the founder of the American Nazi Party. CBS executives panicked. They told Dylan he had to change the lyrics or pick another song. Dylan refused. Without hesitation, he walked away from the show. For a young artist still building his career, this was a major risk. He could have chosen another song and reached a massive audience. But for Dylan, integrity came first. The decision made headlines. Many saw it as a bold stand against censorship. Even Ed Sullivan himself reportedly disagreed with the network's choice. Though the performance never happened, the controversy helped shape Dylan's image. He wasn't just a musician, he was an artist, willing to challenge authority, no matter the consequences. Decades later, the same refusal to conform would earn him one of the highest honors in the world. On October 13, 2016, the Swedish Academy awarded Dylan the Nobel Prize in Literature. He became the first songwriter to win since the prize was established in 1901. The Academy praised him for having created new poetic expressions within the great American song tradition. His lyrics, influenced by folk music, modernist poets, and the beat movement, had long been recognized for their depth. Now, they were being honored as literature. His reaction was unusual. At first, he said nothing. Days passed without a response. Some wondered if he would even accept the award. Eventually, he acknowledged it, calling the news amazing, but saying little else. When the award ceremony took place in Stockholm on December 10, 2016, Dylan did not attend. Instead, Patti Smith performed A Hard Rain's Egg on a Fall, and U.S. Ambassador Azita Raji delivered his speech. Dylan finally accepted his medal and diploma on April 2, 2017, in a private ceremony with 12 members of the Swedish Academy. To claim the prize money, 8 million Swedish kroner, or about $900,000, he had to deliver a Nobel lecture. He did so on June 5, 2017, in a speech that reflected on 3 literary works that shaped him: Moby Dick, All Quiet on the Western Front, and The Odyssey. He spoke about how songs differ from traditional literature, arguing that they are meant to be heard, not just read. Not everyone celebrated Dylan's win. Some critics questioned whether songwriting qualified as literature. Writer Irvine Welsh dismissed it as a nostalgic decision. Others believed it was a groundbreaking choice that redefined what literature could be. Either way, the award confirmed Dylan's place as one of the most important cultural figures of modern times. Beyond the Nobel Prize, his list of achievements is staggering. In 2012, President Barack Obama awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom. In 1997, he received the Kennedy Center Honors. He was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1988. Over the years, he has won multiple Grammy Awards, including Album of the Year for Time Out of Mind in 1998 and Best Contemporary Folk Album for Modern Times in 2007. In 2001, he won a Golden Globe and an Academy Award for Things Have Changed, a song from the film Wonder Boys. In 2008, he received a Pulitzer Prize Special Citation for his impact on American music and culture. Several of his recordings, including Blowin' in the Wind and Like a Rolling Stone, are in the Grammy Hall of Fame. He even holds an honorary doctorate from Princeton University and has been inducted into both the Songwriters Hall of Fame and the Nashville Songwriters Hall of Fame.